Hello, and welcome back to The Cut. I'm your host. This is Jay Jones, and today we're examining diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We're talking about the distinguishing between symbolistic gestures and substantive changes that actually transform organizations and communities. And of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion is commonly known as DEI. It's all over the news. We're hearing a lot about it in not so good of a light, but having worked in DEI for the last 25 years or so in my positions and in my profession, I can tell you it's very important, and it's something that we should definitely try and keep around. So since 2020, a lot of American institutions, from corporations to universities, have dramatically expanded their DEI commitments. Uh, but which approaches actually create meaningful change and which merely provide the appearance of progress? It's a big question, huh? Today, showcase organizations making genuine changes and provide metrics for measuring meaningful conversations. The conversation isn't about political correctness. It's about what actually works to create more equitable institutions. Whether you're skeptical of DEI efforts or a strong supporter of DEI, this exploration of effectiveness versus symbolism offers insight relevant to workplaces and communities across America. So let's get into the first topic. Let's begin by distinguishing between performative and substantive approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Performative DEI typically focuses on visibility and appearances without addressing underlying structures. Common examples of this include diversity statements without any accountability measures, one time trainings without follow up or structural changes, highlighting diversity individuals or diverse individuals in marketing while maintaining inequitable practices, creating DEI positions without authority or resources, and setting targets for representation without addressing retention or advancement. Now, as a DEI professional, I can tell you these are very, very common. And there are a lot of organizations who do these things. And it's the work is tough to sometimes either help them see it, whether it's unconscious or not, or to actually get this change done with an executive committee. And there are a number of reasons for that. But let's talk about continue to have this chat. So these approaches often reflect what scholars call diversity washing, which is the appearance of commitment without meaningful change. And they can actually be counterproductive by creating the illusion of progress while leaving fundamental inequities intact. We see this a lot. Um, when we talk about companies with a lot of nepotism, or right now what we're hearing is, you know, the word merit. What does that look like? Today, I was having a discussion with someone about the use of the term values and how if how it really diminishes the the company's overall viewpoint or perspective of the employees when the company continues to harp on values. However, they display uh, this same type of non ineffective diversity practices, and employees can recognize it. The reason why you have like employee resource groups and such um, is so that employees can voice their opinions, and oftentimes the employees do voice these very things as problematic with the firm. However, there's not much you can do as long as the firm is making those decisions. In contrast, though, from the diversity washing, substantive DEI approaches focus on transforming systems and structures. These approaches typically incorporate equity considerations into core business processes and decision making. They address power dynamics and resource allocation. They include accountability mechanisms with consequences, invest significant resources in structural changes, measure outcomes rather than just activities or intentions, and connect DEI to the organization's mission and strategy. Substantive approaches recognize that diversity without equity and inclusion offer limited benefits. Having diverse representation in a fundamentally inequitable system may check a box, but won't transform organizational culture or outcomes. This distinction matters because resources invested in performative approaches often yield minimal return, creating DEI fatigue and skepticism. Meanwhile, substantive approaches can transform organizations and communities in ways that benefit everybody involved. And so now what we'll do is we'll talk about a case study. So this is a case study in effective DEI. And so we'll examine several organizations implementing substantive DEI approaches and identify what makes their efforts effective. And I haven't said it yet, but if you have any questions while we're in this stream, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will try my best to see them when they pop up. But if not, I will definitely capture them before we finish tonight. So the West Side Collaborative, which is healthcare, this network of community health centers serving predominantly low-income communities of color transformed their approach to equity by redesigning their governance structure. So they established a community governing board with real decision-making power over strategic priorities and resource allocation. The result wasn't just symbolic representation, but a fundamental shift in how decisions were made. Community priorities directly influence hiring, service design, and capital investments. Patient outcomes improved significantly, particularly for chronic conditions like that were disproportionately affecting communities of color. So then we want to talk about caliber manufacturing. So, and of course, that was again how in healthcare you can have a substantive approach and make real change. In that case, the community was able to actually benefit from the DEI initiatives that the healthcare company had in place. So Caliber Manufacturing, which is a mid-sized manufacturing company, took a data-driven approach to equity. They conducted a comprehensive audit of hiring, promotion, and compensation practices, identifying specific points where disparities emerged. Rather than generic diversity training, they redesigned these specific processes. For hiring, they implemented structured interviews with consistent questions and rubrics. For promotions, they created clear advancement criteria and manager accountability for developing talent. Manager accountability for developing talent. And for compensation, they established regular equity analysis with adjustment processes. So the results included a 40% increase in diversity at management levels within 3 years, and the elimination of previously significant pay gaps. Importantly, though, these changes benefited all the employees by creating a more transparent and fair system. The reason I said employee development by managers again is it's hard to hold someone accountable as a leader if you're not doing everything as a leader that you can to ensure that they are the best at what they do. If you're not offering them opportunities for growth and development, then you as a manager are failing. So I would like to point that out. And there are many companies who tend to hold employees accountable, but not managers. And if you have multiple employees that you're hiring and they all leave and they all were hired by this same manager and they leave in a short amount of time, there's a real strong possibility that it's probably the manager and not just the employees. So here's another example. Eastview Public Schools. The school district addressed educational equity by fundamentally changing resource allocation. So Rather than distributing resources equally across schools, they implemented a weighted student funding formula that directed additional resources to schools and students who needed it. They combined this structural change with systemic examinations of curriculum, disciplinary practices, and student assignment policies. The approach required difficult conversations about historical inequities, but resulted in measurable improvements in student outcomes across demographic groups. So when we talk about these historical inequities, it's something that when it comes up, you'll like, why should you know it's a I was watching a conversation with a young woman who had the question come up from one of her constituents about um, feeling like taxpayers are paying for um, the taxes for the students who went to school and don't want to pay their loans back. Well, the there is an iniquity, a historical iniquity regarding student loans and how just basically having the loans impact people of color, specifically Black Americans, because the ability to earn wealth and keep wealth has a lot to do with how much debt you have. And in a nation where historically there were zero interest loans given to white Americans and denied to Black Americans, and with those zero interest loans, white Americans were able to purchase homes whose value, the home's values have increased, 300-400% over the last few decades. And again, those were benefits that were not offered to Black Americans. So the inequity here is the wealth that the white families have now as a result of having the value in their homes that they were able to get loans for when Black people could not get loans for, is something that we cannot expect the Black Americans to have, to be equal in that case. So again, there are some inequities that we have to address and we have to discuss and we have to talk about whenever we have these disagreements about certain things here in the country. So that's one of the things DEI does for us is it gives us a platform by which we can have those conversations. So the last case study I'll talk about is Tech Access Initiative. And so the Tech Access Initiative was an industry coalition, and they moved beyond diversity rhetoric by focusing on economic inclusion throughout their supply chain. So member companies established specific procurement targets with businesses owned by underrepresented groups and provided capacity building support to help these suppliers compete effectively. I think we spoke about that last week when we talked about commercial real estate. So rather than just counting diverse suppliers, they measured the economic impact in terms of jobs created, wealth generated in undeserved communities, and growth of these businesses over time. The initiative created substantial economic benefit while also expanding the industry's talent pipeline and market reach. So these case studies share common elements that distinguish them from performative approaches. They focus on systems and structures rather than individual attitudes. They tie DEI directly to core organizational processes and outcomes. They allocate significant resources to implementation. They establish clear accountability mechanisms. They measure impact rather than just activities. So with that said, I'll check to see, okay, I don't see anything in the chat. So next what we'll do is we will measure meaningful DEI outcomes. And how do we do that? So how can we evaluate whether DEI efforts are creating meaningful change? Now, let's explore some metrics and evaluation approaches that go beyond counting representation. And so before I talk about beyond representation numbers, Let's talk about how in the last segment we mentioned auditing. I think as a DEI leader and as a DEI executive, once I get to a firm, the first thing I want to do is audit the practices, not just your HR practices, but your business practices. Like what job group or business group or job title makes the most money, who makes the least amount of money, uh, what is each group responsible for? Now, what is the demographic um, um, composition of those groups? How many women? How many males? Of course, the race and ethnicities of women and males. But the reason I want to do that is because what I'm trying to build is just an argument for how the company could help alleviate liability by implementing DEI strategies, not just performative or not just performative, strategies, but substantive strategies. Things like let's hold managers accountable for their talent pools that they're interviewing for, talent pools. Let's remove some identifying information from the resumes before the manager sees them. Those kinds of things. It's kind of known that the groups that make the most money in most organizations um, are the groups that are dominated by white males. And if that is the case, why do they make more money than anybody else? Why are they in those positions, in those roles, and no one else is able to? Are you hiring? Are you promoting internally, or are you hiring externally? Those are questions that kind of can help you get to whether or not there is nepotism or golf course conversations that are happening that just totally provide disregard for the hardworking employees that you have in house right now. And so it's good to audit the firm first. That way you give the firm a goal, an objective that we're here to meet. And it helps you as a DEI strategist to to make yourself important in the firm and not just be someone that they look for to make them look good. Okay. So now we'll talk about beyond representation numbers. So while demographic representation matters, effective measurement looks beyond simple head counts to examine retention rates across demographic groups, promotion rates and time to promotion, some of the things I just mentioned, pay equity at each level, not just organization-wide averages, which is very common, distribution across departments and roles, not just organizational totals, representation in decision-making positions and governance structures. Very, very important. Who's at the table when the decisions are made, how this firm is going to move forward. Next, we have experience and belonging measures. Substantive inclusion can be measured through differential experience measures, comparing workplace experiences across groups, psychological safety indicators, and there are plenty of companies and consultants out there who do psychological safety type of testing within the firm, so to speak, or surveys to gather that type of information. Next is contribution measurements, whether diverse perspectives actually influence decisions or not. And retention and referral patterns, whether people choose to stay and recommend the organization. It's a big deal. So structural and system measures, which is effective DEI transform systems, which can be measured through resource allocation patterns, process equity assessments, decision-making analysis, who has input, who decides. And then you got policy impact analysis, how policies affect different groups. So again, as DEI leaders and DEI experts, we are a very busy group of people, when a lot of these things could potentially be done and looked at by organizations and handled by the organizations in HR if 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 the leaders would allow these things to happen. So it's more about influencing leaders than anything else. Um, so let's talk about well, actually, let me bring up these equity measures, so equity metrics. So nowadays what we're seeing is we're seeing a younger generation and a more diverse generation taking the lead in some very impactful uh, or very powerful roles, leaders of states and cities and towns. And what we're learning is these these new and diverse talented leaders are going back and looking at the history of their areas, and they're finding out how the communities were um, negatively impacted, and how they can find a way to provide what's called intentional equity, or a way to right a wrong that was done, um, to members of a diverse community. And we're seeing that quite a bit now. So those are what I consider to be external impact measures, which is organizations making substantive progress often measure their external impact through community economic impact, supplier diversity outcomes, product and service accessibility and relevance, and market expansion in diverse communities. So in other words, if that freeway was built there to divide that Black community from downtown, why don't we extend our services? Whatever is going on, we're building here in this development, let's extend those services over that freeway. Let's build a mountain over the freeway so that it's a grassy space that's going to just simply make it seem like it's just a transition from this development into the community. How about making a well-lit and very active pathway of an old street that goes to the next community? Just anything you can do to invite that community into that new development. Return on investment analysis. So substantive DEI initiatives typically demonstrate ROI through innovation metrics, market expansion, talent acquisition and retention cost reduction, risk reduction. So fewer complaints and lawsuits, which is a big one. It is a big one that is often overlooked, and improved decision-making quality. Um, I say that being a lawyer, it's one of the things I look at most is risk reduction. And I found that it is one of the most impactful ways to engage your leadership team when you get to an organization, because if they know that they are at risk because some of these practices are sketchy, really work with you and come up with the best outcomes for the firm. And DEI becomes a part of the firm's overall strategy and mission versus just something, you know, something that's a thorn in the firm's side. So one note is organizations that implement effective measurement approaches share their data transparently, establish accountability at leadership levels, and use metrics to drive continuous improvement rather than simply reporting numbers. Uh, how, so now that we've reported these numbers, what are we what's the goal or objective to change them? How are we going to change them? And that's where, as a DEI leader, you need to be ready to answer that question. This measurement approach contrasts sharply with performative metrics that focus on activities, trainings conducted, statements issued, rather than outcomes, or that examining equity or inclusion dimensions. So let's talk about implementing substantive DEI. And for organizations seeking to move beyond performative approaches, what does implementing substantive DEI actually involve? The first thing it involves is leadership commitment with accountability. So leadership can say, I'm committed, I'm committed, I'm committed all day. If they don't put in place some type of accountability metric, then they are blowing smoke. Meaningful change requires genuine leadership commitment demonstrated through personal engagement, not just delegated responsibilities, allocation of significant resources, willingness to change their core processes, accountability for outcomes, including compensation ties. So, how much are you paying folks for doing extra hard, maybe in your support team and not on your core team? And lastly, consistency between stated values and actions. So, structural integration. Effective implementation integrates DEI into organizational structure through incorporation of strategic planning and core metrics. Um, let's talk about the integration of operational processes and decisions, clear authority and decision rights for DEI functions, connection to budget processes and resource allocation, and embedded responsibility across functions, not siloed. The one that stands out most to me there is the clear authority and decision rights for DEI functions. It is way too often that your HR leader or your chief human resources officer is the person who has to thwart off DEI practices, um, are too eager to say no rather than going back to the leadership team um, about the implementation of substantive approaches. So you have to have continuous learning and improvement. And the ongoing learning with substantive approaches is regular data collection and analysis, willingness to acknowledge failures and adjust, external benchmarking and best practice adoptions, feedback mechanisms with real influence, evolution of strategies based on outcomes. So, in other words, don't just toss out strategies and keep them going if you're not seeing any benefit to them. We have stakeholder engagement, which is effective implementation engages diverse stakeholders. So meaningful involvement in design and evaluation. So that means we want the stakeholders to talk about what this design and how we're going to evaluate it looks like. Authentic community partnerships. So we want community partnerships, transparent communication about progress and challenges. In other words, don't lie and say that you're doing well when you know that you're not doing well. Shared ownership of both the processes and the outcomes with the community. And the shift from performative to substantive DEI isn't just a matter of doing more, it requires doing differently by addressing power, resources, and structures rather than focusing primarily on awareness, representation, or language. Okay. So, as we've explored tonight, the difference between performative and substantive DEI isn't about intention, but impact. Meaningful progress requires moving beyond symbolic gestures to transform the systems and structures that perpetuate integrity or inequity, rather. Um, Organizations implementing substantive approaches focus on changing core processes, measuring meaningful outcomes, establishing real accountability, and allocating resources accordingly. Their efforts yield tangible benefits, not just for underrepresented groups, but for the overall organizational effectiveness and community impact. The distinction matters because resources invested in performative approaches often yield minimal return, creating DEI fatigue and skepticism. Meanwhile, substantive approaches can transform organizations and communities in ways that benefit everybody involved. Throughout this segment of conversations, we'll continue to explore how economic justice connects to various aspects of American life, from constitutional rights to corporate power, from political systems to alternative economic models. Thank you for joining me tonight for this episode of the Cut Podcast. Subscribe to @Cut Podcast on YouTube. Actually, I just made a change. It's now subscribe to @JJones Conversations. And don't forget the E. That is JAYEJONES Conversations on YouTube for new episodes every week. And check our show notes for resources on implementing and measuring substantive DEI approaches. Until next time, remember that effectiveness in creating more equitable institutions isn't about saying the right words. It's about changing the systems that determine who has access, opportunity, and influence. Thank you.